Imagine this. It's minus 40 degrees Celsius. Your fingers are blackened with frostbite. You haven't eaten in 3 days. The man next to you in the trench just took a bullet through the throat and is drowning in his own blood. And the only thing keeping you from completely losing your mind is a 100-gram ration of vodka that burns like liquid fire down your frozen throat. This was the daily reality for millions of Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front during World War II. But here's what history books don't tell you, that vodka wasn't just a comfort. It was a weapon, a tool of control, and for hundreds of thousands of men, it became a prison more inescapable than the war itself. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the darkest, most disturbing aspects of the Eastern Front, the systematic use of alcohol to turn ordinary men into killing machines, and how the Soviet military-industrial complex used vodka as deliberately as they used bullets. This is the story of Ivan Mikhailovich Sokolov, a composite character based on thousands of real testimonies, letters, and military records. His story is their story, and it's absolutely horrifying. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, where vodka was both salvation and damnation. Let's start our story in 1938, in a small village called Krasnoyarsk, about 300 kilometers east of Moscow. Ivan Mikhailovich Sokolov was 20 years old, the son of a farmer who had survived collectivization by sheer luck and submission to the party. Ivan was not particularly political. He wasn't a fervent communist, nor was he a dissenter. He was, by all accounts, ordinary. He had thick black hair, a strong back from years of working the fields, and dreams that extended no further than marrying Katya Petrova, the daughter of the village schoolteacher, and perhaps one day owning a better plough. The village of Krasnoyarsk was typical of rural Soviet life in the late 1930s. About 400 souls lived there, clustered around a single muddy road that turned into an impassable swamp every spring. There was one general store, one church that had been converted into a community centre, and fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Ivan's family lived in a small wooden izba traditional Russian cabin that his grandfather had built with his own hands. In winter, the family shared the space with their 2 goats and a cow, because the animal heat helped keep everyone from freezing to death. The smell was terrible, but smell doesn't kill you. Cold does. Now, here's something important to understand about rural Russia in this period. Vodka was already a significant part of life, but it wasn't yet the monster it would become. Ivan's father would have a drink on holidays, at weddings, at funerals. It was social. It was ritualistic, but it wasn't daily, and it wasn't pathological. Ivan himself had been drunk exactly 3 times before he was conscripted. Once at his sister's wedding when he was 16. Once when his friend Dmitri got them a bottle they weren't supposed to have. And once at the New Year celebration when the entire village got together and someone played an accordion while they danced in the snow. These weren't traumatic experiences. They were normal. Vodka meant celebration, meant community, meant rare moments of joy in a hard life. Ivan would get dizzy, laugh too loud, maybe vomit in the bushes and wake up with a headache. That was the extent of it. His relationship with Katya was sweet and uncomplicated. They'd known each other since childhood. She had blonde braids and a gap between her front teeth that Ivan found endlessly charming. They would meet by the old oak tree at the edge of the village, and she would tell him about the books she'd read. Katya was one of the few people in the village who could read well, and he would tell her about his plans for their future. "When we're married," he told her one evening in the summer of 1939, "I'll build us a bigger house, with a separate room just for sleeping, and we'll have 6 children. She laughed. 6? Why 6? 3 boys, 3 girls, balanced. You have it all figured out. I do. but neither of them had figured on the war. The Soviet Union had been preparing for conflict for years, of course. Stalin knew war with Germany was coming. Everyone knew, even if they didn't say it out loud. The military had been expanding, industrializing, training. But in the villages, far from Moscow and Leningrad, life continued with a kind of willful ignorance. The war, if it came, would happen somewhere else, to someone else. Ivan received his conscription notice in March of 1940. He was to report to the military commissariat in the nearest city within 2 weeks. His father said nothing when the letter arrived, just stared at it for a long time before folding it carefully and handing it to Ivan. His mother cried quietly while cooking dinner that night. Katya cried too, but not in front of him. She was strong that way. "I'll come back," Ivan promised her the night before he left. "I'll serve my time and come back, and we'll get married, and everything will be exactly as we planned." She nodded, but her eyes said she didn't quite believe him. The day he left, the entire village came to see him off. It was a cold, grey morning, and there were 6 other young men leaving with him. The women wailed and crossed themselves despite the official atheism of the state. The men shook hands and clapped shoulders and said gruff, inadequate things about duty and honour. Ivan's father pulled him aside just before he climbed into the truck that would take them to the train station. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "In the army, they will try to break you. They will try to make you into something you're not. Don't let them. Remember who you are. Remember where you come from." "I will, Papa." And Vanya, his father used the diminutive form of his name, something he rarely did. "Be careful with the drink. In the army, vodka flows like water. I've heard stories. Don't let it take you." Ivan nodded, not really understanding. How could vodka take anyone? It was just a drink. He would understand soon enough. The train to the military base took 2 days. Ivan and the other conscripts were packed into a freight car with about 40 other young men, all heading to various units across the Western Soviet Union. The car smelled like unwashed bodies, cigarette smoke, and fear, though no one would admit to the latter. Most of the men were from small villages like Ivan. A few were from cities you could tell by their clothes and the way they talked, faster and with more sophistication. One of them, a kid named Alexei from Moscow, had actually been to a university before being conscripted. "What did you study?" Ivan asked him. "Engineering. I was going to build bridges." "Were you any good at it?" Alexei shrugged. "I'll never know now, will I?" The military base was located in Belarus, not far from the Polish border that had been redrawn after the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. It was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, training grounds, and administration buildings, all surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The first thing Ivan noticed was the smell. It was a combination of diesel fuel, cabbage soup, latrine pits, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that he would later recognize as the smell of fear and violence. The conscripts were lined up in the muddy courtyard and addressed by a senior sergeant named Volkov. He was a thick-set man with a face that looked like it had been carved from wood with a dull axe. His eyes were small, cold, and constantly moving, assessing, judging. "You are nothing," he told them, his voice carrying across the silent ranks. "You are not men. You are not even dogs. You are meat, raw meat, and we are going to cook you until you are useful to the Red Army. Some of you will break. Some of you will die. We don't care. The motherland needs soldiers, not boys. Do you understand?" "Yes, Comrade Sergeant," they shouted back, the words clumsy in their mouths. The first weeks were exactly as brutal as Volkov had promised. They woke at 5 in the morning to the sound of a whistle that seemed designed specifically to shatter your skull from the inside. They had 10 minutes to dress, make their bunks to impossible standards, and assemble outside for roll call regardless of weather. The physical training was relentless, running with full packs, crawling through mud under barbed wire, digging trenches and then filling them in, only to dig them again. Push-ups until your arms trembled and gave out, and then more push-ups. The officers seemed to take particular pleasure in finding creative ways to exhaust them. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the psychological assault. The officers and senior sergeants screamed constantly, inches from your face, their breath hot and rancid. They found fault with everything. Your uniform was never clean enough. Your bed was never made properly. You were too slow, too weak, too stupid. And they beat you. Not officially, of course. Officially, corporal punishment was against regulations, but unofficially, in the barracks after lights out or during training exercises where accidents could happen, the beatings were constant and brutal. Ivan saw his first real beating on his 4th day. A skinny kid from somewhere in Ukraine had failed to salute an officer properly. That night, 3 senior soldiers held him down while a 4th beat him with a wooden baton across the backs of his legs and buttocks. The kid screamed and begged, but they didn't stop until he was barely conscious. "That's nothing," whispered Mikhail, a soldier who had been there for 3 months already and slept in the bunk next to Ivan. "Wait until you see a real beating." "How do you survive this?" Ivan asked. Mikhail smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Vodka, my friend. Vodka makes everything better." And here is where our story really begins. The vodka ration was official Soviet military policy, and it had a long and dark history behind it. The idea of giving soldiers alcohol before battle wasn't new, of course. Warriors had been doing it since ancient times. The Vikings had their mead, the Romans had their wine, but the Soviets systematized it, industrialized it, turned it into official military doctrine. The tradition really took hold during the Winter War against Finland in 1939-1940. Soviet soldiers were dying in the tens of thousands, frozen in the Finnish snow, cut down by Finnish snipers and ski troops who moved like ghosts through the forests. Morale was catastrophically low, so the Red Army instituted the Narkom ration, 100 grams of vodka per soldier per day, named after the People's Commissar of Defense. Later, this would be known as Frontovoi 100 gram, the frontline 100 grams. The official reasoning was practical. Vodka helped soldiers endure extreme cold. It gave them courage before attacks. It helped them sleep despite the constant artillery fire. It was, they said, a military necessity. The unofficial reality was much darker. Vodka made soldiers controllable. It made them dependent. It made them willing to do things that sober men would refuse. And in the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, the Soviet High Command needed men who would march into machine gun fire without question. Ivan received his first military vodka ration on a cold evening in April 1940. The conscripts had finished a particularly brutal day of training. 12 hours of digging trenches in rain that fell like icy needles. Ivan's hands were bleeding, his back screamed with pain, and he was so tired he could barely stand. They lined up outside the kitchen barracks for their evening meal. The food was barely edible watery cabbage soup with occasional chunks of something that might have been meat, and black bread that was more sawdust than grain. But after the meal, Senior Sergeant Volkov appeared with a wooden crate. "Attention!" he barked, and they all stumbled to their feet. "Tomorrow you begin weapons training," Volkov announced. "Tomorrow you start learning to kill Germans. Tonight the motherland provides." He gestured to the crate, and 2 soldiers began handing out small glass cups and filling them from large bottles. Ivan stared at the clear liquid in his cup. It looked innocent enough, like water. "This is your friend," Volkov continued. This is what will keep you warm when it's 40 below. This is what will give you courage when the Germans are coming. This is what will make you a man. To the motherland. To the motherland, they shouted back, and as one they drank. Ivan had drunk vodka before, but never like this. Never straight, never this much, never on an empty stomach after 12 hours of brutal labour. The liquid went down like fire, burning his throat, exploding in his empty stomach like a grenade. He gasped, coughed, his eyes watering, and then warmth. Beautiful, spreading warmth that started in his belly and radiated outward, pushing away the cold, the pain, the exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, Ivan felt good. The ache in his back faded. His bleeding hands stopped hurting. The constant fear and humiliation of military life seemed suddenly distant, unimportant. He felt strong. He felt brave. He felt like maybe he could survive this after all. Good, yes? Mikhail said beside him, grinning. The frontovoy makes everything better. That night Ivan slept deeply for the first time since arriving at the base. No nightmares about Volkov's screaming face. No anxiety about the next day's tortures. Just deep, black, dreamless sleep. He woke with a headache, but it seemed a small price to pay. The vodka ration became a daily ritual. Every evening, after the training and the abuse and the exhaustion, there would be that 100 grams waiting. And every evening, Ivan felt that same rush of warmth, that same relief, that same temporary escape from the horror of his new life. At first he looked forward to it the way he might look forward to a letter from home or a decent meal. It was a bright spot in the darkness, a reward for surviving another day. But gradually, subtly, it became something more. He started to notice that the day seemed longer when he knew the vodka was waiting. He found himself thinking about it during training, that moment when the burning liquid would hit his throat and make everything okay. He started to resent the hours between waking and evening, seeing them as obstacles between him and that blessed relief. And he wasn't alone. All around him he saw the same transformation in his fellow conscripts. The vodka became the centre of their existence, the thing that made everything else tolerable. Just get through today, they would say to each other. Just make it to evening. Some men started to get creative, finding ways to get more than their ration. They would trade their food for extra vodka. They would steal it when they could. They would volunteer for extra duties if it meant access to the supply. Ivan told himself he wasn't like them. He only drank his ration, nothing more. He was in control. But control, as he would learn, was an illusion. By the summer of 1940, Ivan had been in the Red Army for 4 months. He could field strip a Mosin Nagant rifle blindfolded. He could march 20 kilometers with a full pack. He could dig a proper trench, set up a machine gun nest, and throw a grenade with decent accuracy. He was becoming a soldier, but he was also becoming an alcoholic. The transformation was so gradual that he didn't notice it happening. It started with small things. He realized that 100 grams wasn't quite enough anymore. The warmth didn't last as long. The relief wasn't as complete. He needed just a little more to feel the way he used to feel. This is how tolerance works, though Ivan didn't know the word. Your body adapts. What was once enough becomes insufficient. You need more to achieve the same effect, and more, and more. The soldiers had developed an elaborate black market for vodka. There was always someone who could get extra, a cook who skimmed from the supply, a quartermaster who could be bribed, a political officer who looked the other way for a price. Ivan made his first black market purchase in July. He traded his weekly tobacco ration for an extra 200 grams of vodka. He told himself it was just this once, just because the training had been particularly brutal that week, and he needed a little extra to take the edge off. But once became twice. Twice became regular. By August, Ivan was spending every resource he had: food, tobacco, even the few kopecks he managed to save on vodka. His body was changing. His hands shook in the morning until he got alcohol in his system. He sweated at night, even when it was cold. His stomach hurt constantly. He had developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. But worse than the physical symptoms was the psychological dependence. Ivan couldn't imagine existence without vodka anymore. The thought of going even a day without it filled him with a panic so intense it was almost physical. He had tried once. In September, disgusted with himself and worried about what he was becoming, he decided to refuse his evening ration. He would prove to himself that he was still in control, that he could stop whenever he wanted. He made it 6 hours. By midnight, he was crawling out of his bunk, his entire body screaming for alcohol. He was shaking so badly he could barely walk. His heart was racing. He felt like he was dying. He found Mikhail, who always had extra, and traded his boots. His good boots, the ones his mother had bought him for half a bottle. He drank it in desperate gulps, there in the dark behind the barracks, and felt the shaking gradually subside. He slumped against the wall and cried quietly, where no one could see. He was trapped and he knew it. The officers knew it too, of course. They knew exactly what they were doing. The vodka wasn't just about warmth or courage, it was about control. An alcoholic soldier is a dependent soldier. An alcoholic soldier will do anything to maintain his supply. An alcoholic soldier won't desert, won't question orders, won't rebel, because he can't survive without the system that feeds his addiction. It was brilliant, in a horrifying sort of way. By the time December came, Ivan was drinking 4 to 5 times his official ration every day. He had bartered away everything he owned. He had stolen from fellow soldiers. He had volunteered for the most degrading duties in exchange for extra vodka. His letters to Katya became less frequent. When he did write, they were short, vague, filled with lies about how well he was doing. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he barely remembered the man who had promised to return to her and build a house with a separate sleeping room and father 6 children. That man was gone, drowned in vodka. Winter brought new horrors. The cold that year was exceptional, even by Russian standards. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius regularly. Men froze to death in their sleep. Frostbite was epidemic. The vodka ration was increased to 150 grams per day. For warmth, the officers said. And it did help with the cold in a way. Vodka creates a sensation of warmth by dilating your blood vessels, bringing warm blood to the surface of your skin. But here's the cruel irony. While vodka makes you feel warmer, it actually makes you more vulnerable to freezing to death. That warm blood at your skin's surface means your core body temperature drops faster. Countless soldiers died because they drank vodka, felt warm, fell asleep in the snow, and never woke up. Ivan saw it happen a dozen times that winter. A man would step outside to relieve himself, drunk on his ration plus whatever extra he'd acquired, and simply not come back. They'd find him in the morning, frozen solid, a peaceful expression on his face because he'd died feeling warm and happy. Christmas, or rather the winter holiday, because Christmas was forbidden under the officially atheist state, brought a special vodka ration. Double the normal amount. The officers made speeches about the generosity of the motherland and the importance of morale. Ivan got spectacularly drunk that night, so drunk he couldn't walk. So drunk he vomited until there was nothing left to vomit, and then kept vomiting anyway. So drunk that Mikhail and another soldier had to carry him back to the barracks. He woke the next morning with no memory of the night before, and blood on his shirt that he hoped was his own. "What happened?" he asked Mikhail. "You don't remember?" "No." Mikhail looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe that's better." The news came early in the morning of June 22nd, 1941. Ivan was awakened not by the usual whistle, but by the sound of running feet and shouting voices. Something was wrong. Even through his hangover, he could sense the panic. Everyone up, full kit, move, move, move. They stumbled out of their bunks, confused, half asleep. Volkov appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Germany has invaded," he said simply. "We're at war." The words didn't fully register at first. At war. But there was a non-aggression pact. Stalin and Hitler had signed it. Everyone knew about it. But pacts, as they were about to learn, were just paper. The scale of the German invasion was unprecedented in human history. Operation Barbarossa involved 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft, all crashing into the Soviet Union along a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Ivan's unit was stationed in Belarus, directly in the path of Army Group Center, which was driving toward Moscow. Within hours, they were loaded onto trucks and sent west toward the sound of guns. The journey was chaos. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing east, women, children, old men, all their possessions piled onto carts or strapped to their backs. German aircraft strafed the roads at will, killing indiscriminately. Ivan saw things in those first days that would haunt him forever. A woman holding a dead child sitting by the side of the road, rocking back and forth. An old man shot in the head, his brains scattered across his cart full of books. Entire families burned alive in their vehicles after a German bomber attack, and through it all the vodka flowed. The officers seemed to understand that normal rations wouldn't be enough for what was coming. They broke out the reserves. Men drank in the trucks, drank while marching, drank while digging defensive positions. They had to. How else could you process what you were seeing? How else could you prepare yourself for what was coming? Ivan's first combat experience came on June 25th, 3 days after the invasion began. His unit had been ordered to hold a small village against the German advance. They had maybe 300 men, most of them poorly trained conscripts like Ivan. They had rifles, a few machine guns, and some anti-tank rifles that everyone knew would be useless against German armour. The Germans attacked at dawn. Ivan had been given his vodka ration just before the battle, plus an extra 100 grams for courage. He drank it in 3 quick gulps, feeling the familiar warmth spread through his body, pushing away the terror. The world became strange and dreamlike. The sound of artillery seemed distant, muted. The whistle of incoming shells was almost musical. When the German infantry appeared at the edge of the village, advancing in perfect formation, they seemed unreal, like figures in a film. He raised his rifle, aimed at a German soldier, a real person, someone with a mother and maybe a girlfriend like Katya, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The German fell. He felt nothing. The vodka had numbed him, insulated him from the reality of what he'd just done. He reloaded, aimed, fired again, reloaded, aimed, fired, mechanical, automatic. Around him men were screaming, dying, falling apart. But through his vodka haze, it all seemed distant, unimportant. He just kept loading and firing, his hands working automatically while his mind floated somewhere else. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, more than half of Ivan's unit was dead or wounded. The village was a burning ruin, and the Germans kept coming. They retreated east, fighting and dying every kilometre of the way. The summer and fall of 1941 were an unbroken nightmare of retreat, death and alcohol. The Soviet military was in chaos. Entire armies were being encircled and destroyed. Millions of soldiers were surrendering or being killed. The Germans seemed unstoppable, driving deeper and deeper into Soviet territory. For Ivan and men like him, life became a simple equation: fight, drink, sleep if you could, repeat. The vodka was the only constant, the only thing that made any of it bearable. The official ration continued, but now there was vodka everywhere. When they overran German positions, they would find alcohol schnapps, wine, beer, and drink it all. When they occupied a village, they would raid whatever supplies remained. When they had nothing else, they would drink anything: antifreeze, medical alcohol, even perfume. Ivan watched men die in 100 different ways: shot by snipers, blown apart by artillery, crushed by tanks, burned alive in buildings, drowned in rivers, frozen in the snow, hanged for cowardice or desertion, executed by NKVD troops for retreating without orders. And through it all, the vodka flowed. There's a particular horror to being drunk in combat. Your reflexes are slower. Your judgment is impaired. You're more likely to make mistakes that will get you killed. But you're also numb to the fear, numb to the horror, able to keep functioning when a sober man would break completely. The Soviet command understood this calculus. They would rather have soldiers who were drunk but still fighting than sober soldiers who were paralyzed by terror or trying to desert. By the fall of 1941, Ivan's alcoholism was complete and absolute. He could not function without vodka. His hands shook constantly. He had developed tremors that never went away. His liver was failing, though he didn't know it. He was malnourished, covered in lice, suffering from dysentery and a dozen other ailments. He should have been dead 100 times over, but somehow, through luck or fate or sheer stubborn refusal to die, he survived. He survived the Battle of Smolensk in July and August, where entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. He survived the fighting around Vyazma in October, where another massive encirclement trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. He survived the retreat toward Moscow as the Germans pushed closer and closer to the capital. And in December 1941, half frozen, half drunk, barely human anymore, he found himself in the trenches outside Moscow, waiting for the final German assault that everyone knew was coming. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Celsius. There was no food. The vodka ration had been cut because supplies were running low. Men were dying of cold faster than they were dying of German bullets. Ivan huddled in his trench, his rifle clutched in hands that had long since lost feeling, his mind a fog of withdrawal and despair. He thought about Katya, tried to picture her face, but he couldn't quite remember what she looked like anymore. He thought about his father's warning about the drink, and he wanted to laugh but couldn't because his face was too frozen. He thought about dying, and it seemed like it might be a relief. But then, on December 5th, something unexpected happened. The Red Army counterattacked. It seemed impossible. Everyone knew the Soviets were beaten, that Moscow would fall any day now. But Stalin had brought in fresh troops from Siberia, men who were trained to fight in winter, who weren't exhausted and broken like Ivan and his comrades. And suddenly, miraculously, the Germans were retreating. Ivan and what remained of his unit were pulled back from the front lines for rest and refit. They were given a week behind the lines, in a village that had somehow escaped being completely destroyed. That week should have been a blessing. Instead, it was hell. Chapter 7. Withdrawal. The demon without the bottle. Here's what happens when a severe alcoholic suddenly stops drinking. Their body revolts. Ivan's vodka ration had been cut because supplies were tight, but behind the lines, there were supposed to be reserves. There weren't. A supply convoy had been destroyed by German bombers. For the first time in more than a year, Ivan was facing days without alcohol. The withdrawal symptoms began within 12 hours. First came the shaking. His hands trembled so badly he couldn't hold a cup. Then his whole body started to shake. violent tremors that made his teeth chatter and his bones ache. Then came the sweating. Despite the sub-zero temperature, he was soaked in sweat, his clothes sticking to his body. But somehow he was also freezing, shivering so hard he thought his bones might break. His heart raced, pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, feel it in his throat. It felt like it might burst out of his chest. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw things. Hallucinations, vivid and terrifying. German soldiers crawling out of the walls. Dead comrades rising from the ground, their wounds crawling with maggots, reaching for him with rotting hands. His father, standing in the corner of the room, shaking his head in disappointment. He heard voices that weren't there, screaming, crying, laughter. Sometimes Katja's voice calling his name, but when he looked for her, there was nothing. This is delirium tremens, the DTs as alcoholics call it. It's what happens when your brain, which has adapted to constant alcohol saturation, suddenly has to function without it. It can cause seizures, hallucinations, permanent brain damage. It can kill you. Ivan was delirious for 3 days. Mikhail and the other soldiers tried to help, but there was little they could do. They held him down when he thrashed. They tried to get water into him. They covered him with blankets when he shook with cold, took them off when he burned with fever. On the second night, Ivan had a seizure. His body went rigid, his back arching off the floor, foam coming from his mouth. His eyes rolled back in his head. He stopped breathing. Mikhail thought he was dead, but then somehow Ivan gasped, his body relaxing, his breathing returning. He slipped into unconsciousness, and Mikhail and the others thought maybe that was better. Maybe he would just slip away quietly and be done with it. But Ivan didn't die. On the 4th day, a supply truck arrived with vodka rations. Mikhail forced half a bottle down Ivan's throat, a little at a time, letting it trickle between his lips. Gradually, slowly, Ivan came back. The hallucinations faded. The shaking eased. His heart rate returned to something approaching normal. He opened his eyes and looked at Mikhail. "How bad?" Ivan whispered. "Bad. We thought we'd lost you." "Maybe you should have." "Maybe, but you're not that lucky." When Ivan was finally able to sit up, he caught sight of himself in a piece of broken mirror someone had propped against the wall. He barely recognized the face looking back at him. His eyes were sunken deep in his skull, rimmed with dark circles. His cheeks were hollow. His skin was grey, waxy. He looked like a corpse that hadn't quite realized it was dead yet. He was 23 years old. The week of rest ended. They were sent back to the front. The fighting continued, all through the winter and into the spring of 1942. The Germans had been pushed back from Moscow, but they were far from defeated. The Eastern Front stretched for thousands of kilometers, and on every kilometer men were dying. Ivan fought at Rzhev, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, where Soviet casualties were so high that the full numbers were kept secret for decades. He fought in the forests and swamps, in ruined cities and burned villages, in trenches that filled with mud in spring and became graves. And through it all, he drank. Because the alternative, the withdrawal, the shaking, the hallucinations, the feeling that his skin was crawling with insects, was worse than death.